Do you ever wonder how people slept in the past? How did they find comfort and rest without the modern luxuries of today? Let's travel back in time to the 18th century and discover how sleeping habits have changed. Back then, sleep wasn't as comfortable as it is now. Most people didn't have a bed or a mattress like we do today. Instead, they used a palliasse, which was essentially a sack stuffed with straw. Can you imagine sleeping on that? Plus, these palaces had to be refilled constantly as the straw broke down over time. If you were lucky, you might have a feather bed made of down from geese. But it wasn't easy to make one. It took years to collect enough feathers, and the fabric cover had to be rubbed with wax to prevent moisture from getting in. And even the best feather bed smelled terrible and had to be aired frequently. Nowadays, we have uniform mattresses and comfortable environments to sleep in. But it's fascinating to see how far we've come from those times. Can you imagine sleeping on a straw sack or a smelly feather bed? Let's be grateful for our comfortable beds and modern technology that makes sleeping a restful experience. Some things, however, have stayed the same over time. We all need a good night's sleep, and the importance of restful sleep for our physical and mental health has never changed. In fact, modern research has shown that getting enough sleep is crucial for maintaining good health and cognitive function. So, while we may take our comfortable beds and modern sleeping arrangements for granted, it's important to remember that the need for quality sleep has always been a constant. Whether you're sleeping on a straw sack or a memory foam mattress, getting enough rest is essential for living a healthy, productive life. What do you think about the sleeping habits of people in the past? Would you be able to sleep on a straw sack or a smelly feather bed? Let us know in the comments below. The ultimate in sleeping luxury and comfort, and were well known to keep the wearer warm on the coldest nights. Featherbeds were not mattresses, however, but spread over the mattress, and the diligence and or wealth of the maker determined how thick and luxurious the featherbed was. Note that over the years, the feathers would break down and mat down as well. The featherbed would have to be restuffed from time to time. Many beds had springs made of rope stretched across the frame, from which we get the expression, sleep tight. As the ropes would sag, they had to be tightened from time to time. Although evidence exists that the word tight was also a synonym for well, so the expression sleep tight could also mean sleep well. The second part of that expression is don't let the bedbugs bite. Bedbugs were a horrible nuisance and a fact of life. Rooms would be painted thoroughly to eliminate bedbugs hiding in the cracks. The bugs would be hunted and crushed whenever possible. In addition, lice were a frequent problem. Killing both effectively was often a losing battle. Bedbugs are very hard to eradicate. Homes were much smaller then and centered around the kitchen. It was not unusual for a type of bed that we call a Murphy bed today to be permanently installed in the kitchen so that an elderly or sick person could be monitored and kept near the fire. The bed would be hinged and pulled up against a wall when not in use. In addition, many homes were not insulated, so large wooden cranes would be installed on either side of the fireplace, and at night blankets would be hung over the cranes to make a small room where the entire family would sleep. The blankets held in the heat during the night. In the U.S., examples of crane kitchens and kitchen beds can be seen in the historic village of Storerton in Springfield, Massachusetts. Sleep followed the sun. People went to bed early and got up early. Daylight could not be wasted. The rhythm of life followed in this fashion for centuries and was only seriously disturbed by the invention of the electric light. There is evidence that until the electric light, people slept in shifts. They went to bed in the dark, woke up 4 hours later and accomplished something, then went back to bed again until morning. I think this was not universal, however, though it seems to have been common in some areas. I don't think it was universal because it was really dark at night. Step into the past with me and let's imagine a world without the light pollution that plagues our modern cities. Back then, darkness was pervasive and the only source of light was provided by candles and oil lamps, which cast a feeble glow that was barely enough to see by. Can you imagine working on intricate tasks like sewing or reading small typeface under such dim illumination? It was a true struggle, but people did it nonetheless, sacrificing their eyesight for the sake of work. Moving around at night was treacherous, with many humble homes sporting winding, narrow staircases to save space. There were no stair rails, so one misstep in the darkness could send you tumbling head over heels down the steps. And don't even think about preparing food. Kitchens were typically outside the house to prevent the heat from making the inside unbearable, and there was no running water to speak of. But even if you could brave the darkness to light a candle, it wasn't an easy task. Matches didn't exist until the 1820s to 30s, so people had to rely on pieces of spill or flint and steel to transfer the flame from the fireplace to a candle or lamp. It was a challenging task that required skill and patience. Despite the challenges, people worked hard during the day and slept through the night. But in some roles, like farming or animal husbandry, there might have been more shift sleeping to prepare for the morning chores. Regardless of their schedule, everyone had to contend with the darkness and the risk that came with it. It's hard to imagine living like that now, but visiting preserved villages like Strawberry Bank or Sturbridge can give us a glimpse into what life was like back then. Another issue that impacted sleeping was the blanket. Today we take blankets for granted. It's a common, inexpensive item. But back in the 18th century, a blanket was a precious and dear thing. Giving a blanket was a dear wedding gift because to make one, a family had to shear the sheep, card the wool, spin it into thread and then weave it on a home loom. It was a substantial undertaking to make and own a blanket. In the early 18th century, blankets were traded for beaver pelt. One of the most famous manufacturers of the day was Hudson Bay in Canada, which made standard blankets in sizes called points. These blankets were all wool and highly prized, so much so that they are still made, and a 5-point queen-size blanket can cost $500 or more. The blanket was particularly prized by people who traveled or who spent much time on foot or outside because it could be converted into a capote or jacket with a hood and be used indoors or out. As a reenactor, I own a 5-point Hudson Bay blanket and a capote. The blanket is never used for sleeping outdoors anymore. It's too luxurious. The capote is without a doubt the warmest outer garment I have ever worn, and wool retains its heating properties even when wet. However, the issue with blanket cost changed radically with the Industrial Revolution in England in the early mid-1700s and in the US in the mid-1700s with the construction of the Slater Mill and Lowell's American Manufacturing Company in Waltham, MA. Not only was sleeping habit changed as the price of a blanket plummeted, but the entire social fabric of the region changed as workers moved from being farmhands to factory workers. But the always falling price of blankets was a marvel at the time, no less remarked upon than today's Moore's Law, which talks of the price of technology being cut in half every 7 years. Another thing that is often overlooked is the cleanliness of the bed linens. Washing for the majority of people was a low priority task because of the hours of work and expense required to do a load of laundry. It was common for weeks and even months to go by before most things were washed. Washing was so infrequent that many people did it only twice a year. It was called the Great Wash when everything would be bucked. Bucking was the term for soaking laundry in a giant cauldron overnight in strong light to clean, degrease and whiten it. The work required boiling a great deal of water or boiling water outside in a giant metal tub, which was beyond the budget of most people, so wooden tubs were used with hot water poured in from a bucket or kettle heated over a fire. Just to fill the tub could take hours, while a load of laundry could take an entire day to do, longer if stains had to be treated or cloth needed to be whitened. Therefore, washing was rare. When it was done all at once with boiling water and soft lye soap made from ash and urine and animal fat. Urine has been used since Roman times to make whites whiter. Ash and urine form lye, and if the proportions were wrong, the clean fabric could literally burn the skin, or at least be very irritating. There was also a chemical called dolly blue that was used to whiten clothing or bleach them by adding a slight blue tint to faded grey or yellowing whites. Clothes were stirred in the boiling water with soap using a beetle or washing bat, then rinsed in a nearby river, even in winter, even if the ice had to be broken to do it. This had to be done to wash out the excess lye to prevent skin irritation, and it was sometimes ineffective. Then the laundry was spread on the hedges or bushes to dry in the sun. Mangles, or boxes of heavy rocks, were often used to press the clothes or sheets. There were all kinds of remedies for removing various stains. In any case, you more than likely went to bed in sheets that hadn't been changed in 3 or more months. We won't even discuss the menstrual stains that often accompanied the unwashed sheets. In those days you were very fortunate if you could afford the services of a laundress. As an aside, menstrual pads were invented by a military bandage company in Germany in the late 1800s called the Paul Hartmann Company. They used straps and ties and were inconvenient but better than what they had up till then, which were bolts of cotton, grass, sponges and rabbit fur. The tampon was invented in 1929 by a male doctor named Ehlhaas, who called them catamenial devices and sold the idea to a woman in the 1930s who created Tampax. Ob-style tampons, now popular, were invented by the Nazis in 1936. The pads had to be washed out and reused, but there was much less menstruation then than there is now, too. Girls hit puberty later or were often pregnant or breastfeeding. They went into menopause earlier. The Comstock Act of 1873 made selling or advertising menstrual aids difficult. Women couldn't even stand in line at the store. They put them in a bag and dropped the money in a box. The Comstock Act led to the coining of the term feminine hygiene products to avoid prosecution. Johnson & Johnson copied them in 1886. The development of pads was a major advance for women's independence. In the early 17th century, people had a different approach to sleepwear. Instead of changing into a separate nightgown, they would wear a long shift that doubled as both a shirt and a nightdress. This versatile piece of clothing was worn day and night, day after day, night after night, which made it a convenient but smelly option. Since people owned very few changes of clothing, they didn't need closets or dressers. Instead, they used a blanket box at the end of the bed to store everything they owned. During this time, people didn't wear underwear, and women didn't even have sewn closed crotch panties until the 1920s. To keep warm, they wore nightcaps with little fur balls on the end, which prevented them from shifting too much during the night. In most homes, central heating required a fireplace. Even if a home had only one room, it would still have a fireplace. In wealthy households with upstairs bedrooms, the bedrooms were particularly elaborate, with fireplaces to keep guests comfortable. Despite their romanticism, fireplaces were incredibly inefficient and required an army of servants to maintain. To reduce the workload, fireplaces were primarily maintained in the bedroom, where guests could be entertained comfortably. The menfolk would sit in the dining room or parlor, which were also served with fire. However, even a modest home required a minimum of 5 cords of wood, if not 10, for every fireplace each year. The amount of effort required to cut, split, stack, carry 10 cords of firewood is enormous. In the cities there were firewood wars in the winter where the purveyors of firewood would vastly jack up the prices of firewood as the temperatures dropped. In addition, they would short the size of the cord to maximize their profits. Ships bringing firewood from Maine or Virginia would anchor off the coast until demands for a higher price were met, reminiscent of the oil tankers sitting off the coast of America during the oil crisis of 1973. The same thing would happen when people converted from wood to coal in the mid-1800s. Finally, the cities had to bring in regulators, price limits and firewood inspectors to control the price and quantity of a cord of wood to prevent rioting. The firewood inspectors were so common that in New York, for example, it was common practice to bribe them to look the other way when cords were shorted. In almost every home was a bed warmer, an enclosed brass box with a handle that could be filled with hot coals or heated stones and placed under the mattress or blankets to heat the bed. A cold mattress draws the heat from the body. One more thing, while we take it for granted now, the fire grate wasn't invented until 1650 in Europe, so it was far from universal in the US. Well into the 1700s, people made the fire right on the floor of the fireplace, which was very inefficient and lost a lot of heat due to poor oxygen flow. The Pilgrims didn't even have chimneys, just a hole in the roof for smoke to leave the house. This underscores the continuing sleeping challenges people faced in the 1700s. The mattresses were lumpy and often havens for vermin. The rooms were cold. Your shirt was your pajama and probably reeked, and your bedroom was cold. So if you could, you built a four-poster bed. The four-poster bed seems to have gotten its start in the late 1200s as a way to remain comfortable during the night. Blankets could be pulled from the top to enclose the entire bed and hold in the heat. In addition, in those days, since the bedroom was often the only room heated at night, the servants would also sleep in the same room as the master to tend the fire and stay warm, and the four-poster provided privacy. Four-poster beds became great and important fixtures, so much so that the Great Bed of Ware, a four-poster surviving from 1590, is used as an example of the lengths people would go to create a bed that was not only warm but luxurious. Even Shakespeare wrote about it. Beds were lived in, and the hanging blankets were often so voluminous that a lover or an assassin could hide in them and strike when the person was asleep. Four-poster beds also had the advantage of allowing mosquito netting in the summer when all windows would be open at night. Then there is the case of the traveler. Inns of the period were much smaller and more modest than they are now and had a limited number of beds. Strangers were often required to sleep in the same bed at night and were often robbed in their sleep. This was a very common situation, to have strangers in the same bed. Of course, women travelers were very, very rare in those days and would be separated from the men, but nevertheless, having 5 people who didn't know each other in a single bed was not uncommon. In America, the first hotel to offer an exclusive bed to a patron was the Parker House in Boston in the early 1800s, which still exists today as a luxury boutique hotel. Later it would be the first hotel to offer hot running water, but only in the basement. Sleeping was a constant issue in growing cities, especially for people who made the equivalent of $1.50 per day, and room and board was $5 per week. Incidentally, it's called room and board because in those days a table was called a board, and if you paid board it meant you were entitled to a place at the board or table for food. Awful bunk rooms sprung up where tiers of rough bunks with straw mattresses were provided for 1.5 to 3 cents a night. In those days a penny was denoted using the letter D for the Roman, denarius for penny, and advertised as such, showing bed 3D night outside the room. Incidentally, the letter D for penny is still used in some areas. For example, nails are sold by sizes D, such that a 2D nail or 2-penny nail is a certain size, and so on. Sometimes the bunk could house 3 men at a time. This practice began to be outlawed in the early 20th century, but flop houses existed at least until the 1960s in some places. Sleeping in the 17th century presented another challenge, relieving oneself in the middle of the night, also known as the necessary. During this time, fires would often go out in the middle of the night, leaving the room cold and making it difficult to leave the warmth of the bed. Houses were often drafty, and windows were glazed by a man called a fenster. Over time, the glazing would fail, creating draught that led to the development of the wing chair to keep drafts off the neck. To avoid the inconvenience of leaving the bed, chamber pots were kept under the bed, while wealthier homes had commodes disguised as cabinets that revealed a toilet and catch basin when opened. These required daily cleaning by the owner or servants. However, in urban centers in the mid-1800s, people began dumping chamber pots out of windows or emptying them into gutters, leading to the requirement for flushing toilets in the New York Building Code of 1900. Interestingly, the Otis House in Boston, a large mansion of its day, did not have a single washroom or bathroom. Visitors had to use the outhouse, and toilet paper was not invented until 1858 by Joseph Gaiety. Did you know that in the 17th century, sleeping arrangements were quite different from what we know today? One of the issues people faced was the need to relieve themselves in the middle of the night, which was called the necessary. In those days, the fire would often go out during the night, leaving the room freezing cold. And to make matters worse, houses were often drafty, with windows that would rattle and let in chilly air. That's why the wing chair was invented, to keep drafts off the neck. But what about when nature called? Well, there was always a chamber pot under the bed. In wealthier homes, there were even elaborate commodes disguised as cabinets, which opened up to reveal a toilet and catch basin. However, these had to be cleaned daily by the owner or servants. Later on, in the mid-1800s, there was a major problem in urban centers with people dumping their chamber pots out the window or emptying them into the gutter in the street. It wasn't until the New York Building Code required flushing toilets in 1900 that real toilets and plumbing became common. And if you thought that was bad, consider the concept of bundling. When men had to travel great distances to court a woman, there was often no guest room for them to sleep in. The solution: let the man and woman sleep in the same bed. However, to prevent sexual intercourse, the guardian or parent would bundle the man and woman in separate blankets. There were even chastity partitions that allowed a man and woman to divide the bed with a board or cushion. But even then, it was well known that the chastity partition or bundling board often disappeared during the night, as people succumbed to their desires more often than not. In old New England, the tradition of the engagement ring was often used as a trade for virginity. If a man and woman spent the night bundling and ended up in a sexual situation, he would give her a ring as a bond for the loss of her virginity. Since a woman who was known to have lost her virginity was considered less valuable, the ring would make up for that loss of value if the man didn't marry her. It's interesting to note that in those times, people often slept in the same room, sometimes even with livestock. There were few secrets, and the act of sex between parents was no big secret to children in the same room, often in the same bed. So, what do you think about these sleeping arrangements of the past? Pretty different from what we're used to nowadays, right? For other people, sleeping rough or outside on the ground was a very common practice. People were adept at making beds of boughs to get off the ground. As a reenactor, I have spent many a night on the ground, and it is terrible. Not only does it make you hurt the next day, but the ground is damp and draws the heat from your body. Even a small layer of straw prevents many problems and wicks off some rain. People became adept at sleeping outdoors on a downhill and digging a small trench around their bed of boughs to allow rainwater to drain around them. Army camps had a common practice of doing this. In this environment, the Hudson Bay Capote proved its value over and over again. People often slept in barns or wagons, and coachmen would sleep in the coach during the night rather than pay for a room. Many coaches even had a brazier box under the seats where hot coals could be placed to warm the coach. As time has gone on, we have elevated our sleep behaviors to an apex of comfort and luxury, but in the 18th century, sleep was also held dear, but getting the best night's sleep was, as nearly everything then, a challenge. Thank you for tuning in to learn about the fascinating sleeping habits of 18th century Americans. It's amazing to see how different things were back then, from the lack of electricity and plumbing to the practice of bundling. We hope this has given you a newfound appreciation for the modern conveniences we enjoy today. If you want to continue learning about different inventions, history, science and technology, and many other interesting topics, be sure to subscribe to HeyGPal for more great content. Don't miss out on all the amazing knowledge and insights we have to offer.